Here we have a SAT math question. Okay, let's go the information. There is a graph given over here. So the graph of y equals to f of x is shown. Which of the following best represents the function of f of x? Okay, when I look at the function in each option, it is in factor form. Okay, to get the function in factor form, which represents the graph over here, so we have to consider the x-intercepts of the graph. So here the x-intercept is -3, so it's -1, it's 0, it's +1. Okay, now let's consider the first x-intercept, that is x equals to -3, that's over here. Okay, now to get the factor corresponding to this x-intercept, what I need to do is I have to make the right side over here as 0. Okay, if I want to make the right side over here as 0, I have to add 3 to both sides. When I add 3 to both sides, so this -3 +3 will cancel out. I'm getting x +3 equals to 0. So the factor corresponding to the first intercept -3 is x +3. Okay, now let's check the options which has x +3 as a factor. In option A, we have x +3 as a factor. In option B, we have x +3. In option D, also we have the factor x +3. In option C, we don't have the factor x +3. So we can reject option C. Okay, now let's consider the second x-intercept, that is -1. So x equals to -1. So to get the factor corresponding to this x-intercept, I have to make the right side 0. For that, I have to add 1 to both sides. So the -1 +1 will cancel out. I'm getting x +1 equals to 0. So the factor corresponding to this x-intercept -1 is x +1. Okay, now in the three options A, B, and C, we have to check whether we have this factor x +1. So in all the three, I think in all the three options, in option A and option B, in option D, in all the three options, we have find the factor x +1. Okay, now let's move to the third x-intercept, that is x equals to 0. Okay, here already we have 0 on the right side. So the factor corresponding to this x-intercept is just x. And let's check the options where we get x as a factor. Okay, in option A, we find x as a factor. In option B also, we find x as a factor. But in option D, we don't find x as a factor. So we can reject option D. Okay, now let's move to the fourth x-intercept, that is +1, x equals to 1. Okay, now to get the factor corresponding to this x-intercept, I have to make the right side 0. For that, I have to subtract 1 from both sides. +1, -1 will cancel out. I'm getting x -1 equals to 0. So this is a factor, x -1 is a factor corresponding to the x-intercept 1. So now let's take the options A and B, whether we have this x -1 as a factor. Okay, in both option A and option B, I find x -1 as a factor. So how can we decide whether option A is correct or option B is correct? Okay, for that, first let me go to the first x-intercept -3. So the corresponding factor is x +3. At the x-intercept -3, the graph crosses the x-axis or the graph just touches the x-axis. Clearly, the graph touches the x-axis at the x-intercept -3. Since the graph touches the x-axis at the x-intercept -3, so the corresponding factor x +3 must have even exponent. So whenever a graph touches the x-axis at a particular x-intercept, then the corresponding factor must have even exponent, like 2 or 4 or something like that. Okay, in option A, the exponent of the factor x +3 is 2, which is even number. In option B, the exponent of the factor x +3 is just 1. So here in option A, we get even exponent. So this is the appropriate stuff for the x-intercept and -3. So we can reject option B also. Anyways, option A is correct for this question. We can verify the other factors too. Okay, now let's take the x-intercept -1. So for this -1, the corresponding factor is x +1. At x equals to -1, the graph crosses x-axis. So at a particular x-intercept, if the graph crosses x-axis and the corresponding factor must have odd exponent, 1 or 3 or 5, something like that. And in option A, we find this factor x +1, and also exponent of this factor x +1 is just 1. It's an odd number. So this is appropriate for the x-intercept -1. Okay, now let's consider the third x-intercept, that is x equals to 0. The corresponding factor is just x, and at x is equal to 0, the graph crosses x-axis. So the corresponding factor x must have an odd exponent. So here we find the factor x with the odd exponent 1. Okay, now let's consider the last x-intercept 1. The corresponding factor is x -1. At x equals to 1, also the graph crosses x-axis. So the corresponding factor x -1 must have odd exponent. So here in option A, we find x -1. So with odd exponent 1. So the correct answer choice for this question is option A.